Thank you all so much for coming tonight. My name is Tom Steinmetz, and I'm the CEO here at Washburn Center for Children. So, over the last 3 years at Washburn, we have provided school-based, home-based, community-based therapeutic services for 9,000 children and their 27,000 family members. And I start off by saying that because working with families, supporting families, is fundamental to everything that we do here. It's fundamental to children's healthy mental health and social and emotional development. And tonight is all about families. Now, before I turn things over and introduce Dr. Allen, the other way that we want to celebrate and recognize that is we've also just written a new mission statement that we think really captures the core purpose and the reason that Washburn is here for families. So we'll share this with you and just read it now. Our mission statement is nurturing every child and family's well-being and full potential through transformative children's mental health care. We wanted to make sure that families were center and that we really name and start to recognize mental health. We need to keep making it okay for families to reach out and get help. This is also great timing because May is National Mental Health Month. And coming up on May 10th is National Children's Mental Health Awareness Day. We've got some nice recognition that also just happened. Both Mayor Fry and Governor Dayton have named May 10th as Washburn Center for Children Day. So we'll be celebrating and sharing other information about children's mental health all through the month, but wanted to let you know about that as well. This is the third part in our inaugural Thought Leadership Series this year, and I'm really thrilled and excited for the session tonight with Dr. Bill Allen. In addition, it's amazing what Dr. Allen has done. Former president of the National Council on Family Relations. He has written journal articles. He has a private practice called Healing Bonds right here in Minneapolis. He's been a trainer and consultant all over the state, all over the country, and here at Washburn for 15-some years. Wow. Bill's also a really close friend, and he is one of the kindest and most compassionate people that I know. So I'm really, really thrilled and honored to get to introduce him tonight. And with that, I'm going to just turn things over.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here to talk to you folks about something that's very dear to my heart. It's something that got me out of sales and marketing, which is the field I was in after I got out of undergraduate, and came back into this field, family. The good news is that it's something I'm passionate about and I love, and obviously you are interested, which is why you're here. The bad news is that I also teach graduate courses on family and family relationships, and I've seemed to try to force a semester's worth into 1 hour. And so I don't know how that's going to go, but I should probably just mention that the way that we'll do this, or the agenda for today, is that we'll talk a little bit about what's the definition of a family. What does that look like? We'll talk a little bit about what are family relationships and how do they work. I'm going to spend the middle portion of my talk actually not talking, but showing you a video that looks at how family relationship skills get translated in 3 different environments. I think you'll have some fun with it. Maybe we can have some discussion at the end of my remarks. And then talk about some specific tips to help families who are learning how to build strong relationships, okay? So, and I'm hoping to leave lots of time at the end for questions, your questions, and Q&A. Does that sound like a pretty good agenda, or are there other things that you'd like to get out of tonight that I should know about? I think we have enough time to be able to get through the whole program and also to hear, again, your questions or comments. So with that, why don't we get started? Here are some learning objectives that we've got for today. Basically, what I'm hoping to do is to just show some examples and us to have some conversation about how children, in particular, learn about relationship skills that they then take on into the world or take out into the world later in life. But also talk about how those values and those skills are actually transmitted. That's what we're going to see in the videos that we're going to look at in a minute. So we might want to start by thinking about what is a family, all right? And a good definition is that we're talking about 2 or more people who are related, but more than that, committed to each other And they share intimacy, they share resources, they share decision-making, and they also share values. And all of that has to be communicated from, the old to the young and, between families. And if that's going to work well, then we're going to end up with just lots of different kinds of families, because there's all kinds of values and skills and experiences that are out there in the world. And so families come in all shapes and sizes and all kinds of configurations. But if we think about what are the things that affect that diversity, they might be the kinds of things that you see listed here. Okay? Things like the way that the family is structured, things like ethnicity or culture, their status, socioeconomic status, the affectional preference of the adults in the family or the emerging kids, their belief systems, not just about organized religion or those kinds of things, but their belief systems about themselves. Are we people who seem to survive and seem to do well, or are we losers? Are we people who always get the short end of the stick? All these kinds of things affect how families do family process. And they also shape what kinds of relational or relationship skills kids actually learn and get good at. So I'm going to run through really quickly some family facts. These are the kinds of things that you learn in grad school. Many of you in the room probably are familiar with some of these things. But the idea that a family is actually a social construction. It's not something that's chiseled in stone somewhere. And that as time progresses, families and what families do or have to do for their families starts to evolve. And to understand families, we have to understand something about how they're constructed, why they exist, and how they work. Well, one of the things that they have to do is they have to provide some concrete things for all of the family members that are embedded in the family. Things like stability, security, things like providing for their material needs, okay? Things like being a safe place to learn about intimacy, human sexuality, and things about mutual responsibility, okay? And then families also have to do some things for society. As we're going to see a little bit later, they actually are a kind of intermediary between both the individual family members, but also society as a whole. And one of the things they do for society as a whole is they provide some socialization of children, so that as kids leave families and then move out into the world as adults, they actually have some skills to be able to do the world in ways that are non-destructive. Now, we sometimes do a good job of that as societies and as families, and sometimes, there's a lot to be learned and to be improved on. Family, the term family also suggests that it's some sort of static thing that we can put our finger on. But in fact, families are actually a dynamic idea. And that just as individuals go through stages and have to deal with transitions and change, same thing is true for families, that they go through a developmental stage as a unit. And that's the heart of what's so-called family development theory. One of the theories that really infuses my work is something called family systems theory. And I think that that's pretty prevalent here in the work we do at Washburn. And that is this idea that families are actually made up of individual units and individual subsystems. Okay, this is general systems theory, adopted from general systems theory. And that those systems then aggregate up into larger systems. And that it's the unique nature of what family members do that make families so special, and make their relationships different. So you can have an adult female and a younger female, but the fact that there's a maternal relationship between them changes the way they interact with each other and the kinds of skills that they have to develop to be successful in life with each other as a family, but also outside of the family group as well. And then finally, there's a couple things that we need to understand about what skills families are actually going to take outside of the interior of the family, outside to the exterior. And to understand social behaviors that family members enact outside, we have to understand that, well, what kinds of perceptions and behaviors do they see outside of the family that actually affect what they learn or reinforce inside the family? And all of our interpersonal decisions are actually based on how we think they'll benefit us, both in our families, in our unique, close proximal families, but also on the outside as well. This is just social exchange theory for those of you who are familiar with family science. So I mentioned that we're all kind of motivated by self-interest. If you understand that, then you understand that, conflict, that is conflict in our needs or our wants or our preferences, are all embedded in the family life or any close relationship experience. And one of the things that we have to do is to learn how to manage those differences and how to manage those tensions. And societies that do a good job of doing that within the scope of the family, guess what? They can actually do that outside the family, and those societies can be more peaceful and more just. And so we have some work to do around the world to be able to make that work. And we'll see in the video some examples of how families are successful at doing that, but also how families have some work to do along those lines. Now, there are all kinds of influences and trends that affect what we see when we look at families today. That's a little bit different than what we saw 50 years ago, and that is certainly different than what we saw 100 years ago. Okay? And here are some of the trends that we're talking about. Things like that people are marrying later, if they're marrying at all, that there's a lower rate and lower rates of remarriage, that there's a higher chance of divorce. That divorce number actually sort of spiked in the 60s, 70s, and is actually sort of slowly coming down. But part of that is because there are fewer marriages occurring, right? More people are cohabiting, and there are more out-of-wedlock births. And those things have consequences for how families are formed and what they look like when they're formed. But it also has consequences for increasing family diversity, and that in turn has consequences for how complex family structures have become. There are a number of forces that act on families. You see some of them arrayed around this constellation here. The thing I'd like you to take from this particular picture is that there's a two-dimensional or two-directional flow here, that not only do things like healthcare and neighborhood surroundings and security affect families, but families also shape some of these institutions. Now, granted, some of those forces actually have more sway on the family than the other way around, but there is this bidirectional character to what goes on here. And if you think about this in an ecological sense, okay, in a Brofenberenian sense, that if we look at the family as being in the center here, that there are proximal systems like the neighborhood, okay, or the extended family, that have their own subsystems in them, like the school and work, and then there's larger rings outside of those rings, things like the government, things like the state, things like our nation, and then if you get on a global level, the whole planet. This is just important to keep in mind as we work with families, that there are all kinds of forces that actually are influencing what happens inside that inner circle, that blue circle. And that if we can account for that in the work that we do and account for it in the ways that we teach relational skills, we'll have not only better peace and harmony and success within that smallest circle, but maybe it'll spread out to some of these larger circles as well. So families face all kinds of challenges in their social environment. And these are just a list of some of the things that families have to sort of cope with. Okay? It could be relational instability within the interior of the family. It could be violence, both on the outside and the inside of a household. Changing gender roles and the equity between males and females in families. And then you see some of the others there. The things that I've been most interested in are things like gender roles. I'm interested in the roles that males play in family life across the lifespan and how that changes and how that's influencing how families are looking today versus, say, 150 years ago. I'm interested in culture and ethnicity and how that shapes family process and why that matters in what happens to families differentially because of their cultural background. I'm interested in looking also at the thing that's the third from the bottom, this business about technology. I think this is a kind of a sleeper issue that we don't really talk about it that much, or we started to just study it in family research. But I think there are all kinds of unintended consequences for the progress of technology, particularly communication and internet technology, that basically intrudes on family process. So something as simple as what a family designs as rules about when you can use your cell phone or can you use it at the dinner table, that these things are changing the way that institutions within the family get enacted. But these are just some of the social challenges that face families today. Now, the good news is that there are all kinds of things that we can harness as strengths and as resources to help families be more successful with their relationships, but also at the things that they take outside. So in yellow, you see the things that are family strengths, and we'll talk about some of these a little bit later. Things like communication, the ability to resolve conflicts, things like commitment to each other. But also there's some universal factors across the globe that all families are looking for peace, both within the family but also outside. All families are looking for a sense of freedom and liberty and being able to be themselves, but also looking for justice for themselves and for the people around them. If we can harness those, again, in the ways that we do individual micro-interventions with families and family members, we're going to be more successful, and we're going to make the world more successful. So just a couple of them that we've just sort of touched on are family cohesion. By that we mean, intimacy between family members, the sense of togetherness that families feel. Family flexibility, family's ability to be adaptable and to adapt to change as it comes along. And change can be coming from the outside, but it also can be internal. It can be just, the birth of the first child, or all the kids leaving and couples having to find themselves again. These are all examples of ways that families have to become more flexible and able to change as their surroundings and as their internal dynamics change. And then the thing that lubricates all that is actually family communication. Families that can talk together, that can get their needs and desires expressed and met, those families tend to do well and tend to do better than families where communication is really poor and there's all these unmet needs and unmet and unresolved problems that never seem to go away. And we'll talk a little bit about what are some tools that families can use to be able to address some of these. But some other resources that I want to touch on are the extended family system. When I work with folks here at Washburn in consultation, one of the things I always try to push and ask is, are we harnessing the extended family of the mother and child that are here, or the family members that are here? Are we sort of exploring who else is in the family system or the family constellation who could be part of the solution? Also, I ask us to think about, what's the family's belief system? Do we have a sense of, do they think of themselves as being successful? Do we think of themselves as being contributors, and not only within the family, but to society in general? Or do they think of themselves as being, I can't do for myself. People have to do something for us because we're not good at things, or we don't handle stress well. So that's why we have to close ourselves off or shut ourselves down. So belief systems are important. And then finally, how good are families and how good are we at helping families to engage their larger social systems, all right, the village, if you will. I've talked a little bit before about this business about families being sort of a mediating factor between society on one side and what society needs and wants from the individuals within the family, but on the other side, being the mediator or the filter for the family members themselves of what outside influences are coming at them from the larger society. So families have this kind of unique role in the middle of these two forces, or these two needs or sets of needs. And how do they do that sort of mediating effect? Well, through teaching, all right? Through practice, and also by modeling skills, relationship skills that actually promote healthy relationships. And I'll talk about 3 of these skills in broad categories, and then we're going to take a look at some examples of how this works. One is through direct communication, when parents, other adults, or maybe even peers of kids sort of teach each other directly by saying what they should do or how they should do it, or showing them directly what they want. Sometimes it happens indirectly, but most of the time just direct communication is through verbal means. Also, we do it by modeling, by parents show what they do and what they value, and then that shows for the kids what they should be thinking about and what they should value or how they should treat each other. And again, we're going to see some good examples of this, but this is just basic social learning or social exchange theory. And then finally, families are really, really critical in teaching values. What's important? What's honorable? What sort of brings honor to our family or makes our society work? Okay, and they do that in little day-to-day micro interventions and interactions. And I think if we're aware that that is the way that works, we're in a position to actually shape some of those micro interactions with families and with kids and ask them to be thinking and be intentional about how they do those so that we can get better results, not only with the problems or the issues that they bring to us as clinicians or as the agency like Washburn, but also in schools, in churches and community groups, teams, that kind of thing. Okay, so I've droned on and on for a while. I think now's a good time to stop and take a look at 3 families. And before I'm going to turn off my mic in just a second because I don't want to get a little bit of feedback. But what I want you to be thinking about and looking when you see these examples are, we're going to look at 3 sets of families, or 3 sets of situations. One is going to be some families in Japan. Another is going to be some families in Russia. And the other is some families in the United States. This particular video that I'm going to show was made a little while ago, so it may look a little dated, particularly the things that are going on in the Russian example. But what I want you to think about and to watch and try to observe is what's being transmitted and how's it being transmitted to the kids? What are the adults sort of shaping and trying to teach the kids as they go through the interactions that you're going to see? What are they learning, the kids learning in particular, about communication, how that works? What are they learning about conflict resolutions? When things don't work or things come up short, what do you do? And then finally, I'd like you to pay attention to the kids' faces, because it's really fascinating how their faces sort of transmit or telegraph what they're getting, what they're not getting, and maybe even bringing up their reactions to similar situations that happened in the past, but you see them enacting them in real time. So I'm going to turn this off, and I'm going to switch the monitor here.
In a playground near Tokyo, the values of Japanese culture guide the behavior of parents and children. Childhood observer Jerome Kagan.
Some of the things that we see here this morning, which would be a little different from what we might see in Seattle or Jakarta or Sao Paulo, are first the gentleness of the child's play. No major act of aggression, no seizing of property, no striking of another child. The play is gentle. One does not hear a lot of noise. Japanese mothers don't want their children to make a lot of noise. And the children have unconsciously, automatically, over the first 2 or 3 years of life, adopted those values.
When he questioned mothers in the playground, Kagan found that they were especially concerned with the social consequences of their children's behavior.
よそのお子さんにしてはいけないこと。人に迷惑をかけないっていうことだけですね。
Compared with other cultures, the Japanese mother-child relationship is closer, more intense, and the mother is very much involved in her child's socialization. Although this playground is about 60 or 70 yards in diameter, the children tend to stay in a circle that's about 30 yards in diameter. No mother told them not to wander. It's as if they understand, tacitly, subtly, that there is an invisible psychological boundary. Children weren't born that way. Gradually, they understood that that was a value, and they carried that value unconsciously to this typical morning on the playground.
In Japan, Kagan recognized that the transmission of values and standards of behavior was accomplished almost unconsciously through intimacy between children and parents. When Misha says thank you, it's as if he's mocking Stas's feelings. In the Popov family, lack of intimacy seems to have shut the door to all communication. Just as in Japan, what parents do is as important as what they say. The Popovs want Stas to be more gentle, but how they go about convincing him seems to teach a different lesson.
Конечно, это не выход из положения. Я считаю, что принять физическое такое. Вот. Или как-то по-другому, но не знаю, мне даже вот терпения не хватает с ним.
Studies show that coercive physical punishments breed more aggression. Violence begets violence. From the very beginning, Stas hated our Russian sound technician.
Стас, ну, тебе никогда не бывает жалко?
Никогда. Тебе никогда, а маму жалею.
Маму жалеешь?
А тебе нет.
Понятно. А папу?
А тебе нет.
As we have seen on childhood, character is never the product of genes or environment. It is always the interaction of the two that makes a human being.
Есть сестра.
Studies in the United States found that the families of very aggressive young boys tend to be unresponsive, both to their children's aggressive behavior and to their hurt feelings.
Вот я соседом по башке.
А почему ты другим неприятности создаешь? А? Не знаешь? А как же ты будешь отвечать за свои поступки?
The goal of enlightened discipline is not to get the child to submit, but to want to make the right choices. No guilt-inducing harangue will do that.
Это будет когда-нибудь?
Stas needs special attention.
Или ты все время один хочешь быть? Одному скучно, плохо одному, да? И поиграть не с кем, да? Вот, Стасикова ножку у нас, да?
Кто-то делал мечты. Буду я. Покажи, сколько тебе.
Stas brings to the zoo the behavior he has learned at home. For now, Stas is going round and round in close emotional quarters with his parents. But Stas will grow older, and his family will not always be the only characters in his script. Stas will encounter others, teachers, friends. Life will offer many opportunities that may change Stas's world. With the right sort of understanding of his special needs, with the kind of attention and care that encourages self-esteem, Stas may yet grow and flourish. No child this young can be written off as a casualty of growing up. Childhood observer Robert Hind has studied how the relationships formed at home affect how children get on as they move out into the wider world.
Two of the issues that seem to be crucially important are the sort of control that parents use and the amount of sensitivity or warmth that they show. Parents who use a lot of harsh control and show very little warmth tend to have children who are aggressive in the playground. So also do parents who use very little control, even though they show quite a lot of warmth. The parents whose children are least aggressive are those who use a moderate amount of reasoned control and show at least a moderate amount of warmth.
Warmth and reasoned control are the family script at the Golston House. Everywhere, families reflect their communities and cultures. In their easy relations with each other, the Golstons seem to personify qualities that Americans like to think of as their best: open, fair, good-humored.
You could have fried chicken and we could have been eating.
Anita spent the whole day in preparation.
You've been missing something. Yeah, what you missing?
Felton in cooking dinner.
You just laughing at me, huh? Cheese. I'm too tired to eat, actually. Well,
The Golston children benefit from an instinctive concern for the rights of every member of the family,
I cooked it all day, now I don't want it.
and from a sense that obligations must be fulfilled. Several times, Felton promised Benjamin that they would set up the new toy train.
As soon as I finish, we'll put the tray out. Come on. All right.
You out, boo.
Get up here. Okay?
That's
Give me a hug.
what your dad
Give me a hug.
Most parents can remember making rash promises like Felton's.
Woo, look at that. Oh, I love this kind of stuff. Hey, you got a baby?
Day soon dissolved into night,
Good night, Phil. It was wonderful.
and Christmas was over.
Night, everybody.
Parents' good intentions and children's great expectations passed in the dark.
We'll make it big. Come on, it's all right. It's all right. Say good night, everybody.
bedtime, and the trains were still not set up.
Okay, sit down so you can see. You have to look at this, Benjamin, because the pictures in this book are really, really beautiful. Look, a long time ago. Benji, how can you listen if you're going to sing?
In the children's eager minds, Felton's promise had become a deal.
After this book, we can make a deal.
What are we going to make a deal about?
The train set.
Well, hopefully Daddy will be back, and we'll find out whether or not that's something that you guys are going to do tonight. We'll see. Can I finish now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Then we can show you it, okay?
Let's wait till Daddy gets
We think of siblings mostly as rivals, but they can also be allies, role models, and supportive of each other.
Story. Do you want to
Hey,
finish
Mom,
hearing the
this
story?
you go
Okay.
do this.
Okay. Come here, Daddy. Did you tell them that you were going to set up the train set tonight?
Well, I did kind of stick myself into that position.
Oh, well, we're going to have to undo that. They can't stay after you do that.
Please.
Hi there. What time is it?
7.
No. It's too late. It's much too late. You have to go to bed. I don't know what you're getting up for.
The children feel betrayed, their deal broken.
No, you said Angie. Oh. Deliver me. Oh, wait. Not everybody. Not everybody get God love it. Arthur!
Okay, guys, come on now. Go to the bathroom. Go to the bathroom. All right. We gotta talk about the train, guys.
Yeah. Okay.
Come here.
Okay.
All right. I know. Dad promised you all day that I would put the train together.
But you did.
I didn't. Dad was cooking. That's my got the cooking knife. Blew it. I know. But I'll put the train together tonight. I'll put it together tonight, and tomorrow when you wake up, the train will be together. Okay? Okay, don't make yourself sick, all right? So you gonna make the bed up? Not nice.
That's not nice, buddy.
Just a little bit, okay?
That's not nice of you.
Felton had to work the next day, but he stayed up until 3 in the morning anyway, putting the trains together. In the example of their father, the Golston children learned that promises bind both powerful giants and the weak and little ones.
I think it's very vital to try and keep the promises. A, I show them respect, that I do respect and I do feel that they have self-worth. And B, they feel that they don't feel neglected, they don't feel left out. They don't feel that I don't care about them, and I do.
Where was Daddy sleeping?
Daddy went to work.
You couldn't go to bed,
Who couldn't go to bed?
Daddy,
Why?
because he been very tired.
You want to have some breakfast? Said he couldn't get it to work.
You get the plug in?
Yeah, he did all the pieces and he put the plug in. And he said it didn't work. So when he comes home from work today, he said he's gonna check it out and see if he can fix it.
Okay.
go look at it, okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Here we go. Move. Move, let me sit it down.
This is what it does.
Let me sit it down on the floor.
With train.
Because the Golstons work at treating their children with respect and civility, their children are becoming civilized.
Daddy had all this. I never came downstairs to see where he did it.
The research now makes it clear that the family is the most powerful, the most humane, and by far the most economical system we know for making and keeping human beings human.
Himself the father of 6 and grandfather of 9, childhood observer Yuri Bronfenbrenner maintains that the evolutionary and social forces that produced families have also made them potent transmitters of culture and values.
Thank you for reminding me. I'm taking a minute.
Well, I'm stacking. Is Grandpa going room to get stuff? I'm helping him.
All right, you and I will do it together.
This in the house for me?
The family is where we learn how to deal with other human beings. Huh? The way in which we act toward each other in families becomes the way in which we begin to act toward other human beings outside the family. More than that, the family is the place where the outside world is brought in. There are objects and toys from the outside world that children play with. There's television, there are books, there's information that's conveyed in family conversations that give the child its first ideas of what the world is like out there.
Any pressing thoughts or impressions from the families that we saw? When you think about this idea that we've been talking about families shaping how children do relationships and why that transmission process is so important that we pay attention to in the work that we do, but also as societies if we want to have good outcomes. Any reactions to these 3 families and things that stood out to you? And we'll have time to talk about this at the end as well.
So we're going to ask, could you speak into the microphone so everyone can hear?
Yeah. I found the Japanese family fascinating. Sure. I had a Japanese family live with me, or live in my house for a year. While I was doing some training, they came and rented my house. And apparently their philosophy is like hands-off as the kids are growing until they reach a certain age, and then they discipline more.
Right.
I don't know if that's correct and what your experience is. So it's kind of interesting how that non-communication, and how gentle those children were.
Yeah, it is kind of fascinating that the fact that they're not, hands-on as we are in the West, yet the kids figure it out. I mean, they figure out what they're supposed to do. So when you pour water on my head, I may have a reaction, but then I just watch what everybody else does, and I realize, well, it'll be okay, and I'll go back to what I was doing and playing with the water. And nobody had to say that to them. And yet the mothers said, oh yeah, this is what we're doing, but we're doing it non-verbally. We're doing it in ways that, are not so obvious. So, other thoughts or reactions, the things that you saw that really struck you? If we can get the mic to you.
I actually was struck by the verbal communication and the difference between all 3 families and the kind of that very intimate communication of actually mostly women on the playground in the Japanese, which was also interesting.
Yeah. The
roles, the gender roles, but just the communication and the distance in the Russian predominantly father and son, and then just in the whole family unit of the American family, just the intimacy. And so I was struck how important, how it impacts.
Sure.
Right? And just the comparison of the 3 families.
How it shows up in the children's behavior and their demeanor. Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts before we sort of take a look at some of these skills in specific and more specific? And we'll have time, as I said, at the end to maybe reflect more on the movie, on the excerpts and what we're going to talk about now. Great. Well, let's see if I can push the right button here and get back to the, there we go. So before we looked at the video, we talked about 3 primary relationship goals for successful families and couples, okay? And they included things like achieving some sense of cohesion or intimacy, which is what we were just talking about. And in doing that, cohesion, we're talking about balancing 2 seemingly opposing forces, the need for some separateness or some independence, but also the need for togetherness. And one of my mentors, Dr. David Olson at the University of Minnesota, really helped me to understand that cohesion is actually what's called a curvilinear relationship, that too little of one thing or too much of another thing can be problematic, but if you get the balance right, then it's good. So too much separateness, if families are too separate, and they don't have a sense of intimacy, they don't have a sense of belonging to something. By the same token, if they're too fused or too, enmeshed with each other, that's not good either. You want a good balance, which produces good cohesion. Flexibility is another one of these things that families or we should be encouraging families to really strive for. And they're balancing the need for stability or for things to be predictable or to be kind of the same or consistent versus things to be changing and to be flexible enough to handle outside influences, but also the developmental changes that families go through. And again, what we want is a good balance between stability and change. We don't want things so stable that they're rigid, and we don't want things so changeable that they feel chaotic to the family members. And what makes all this work is something called communication. Think about families as an engine, and think about communication as being oil, or the oil or lubrication that makes the engine run. If there's not enough communication, guess what happens? The engine seizes up, and we got problems. Okay? So communication helps us negotiate the right levels of things like cohesion, flexibility, and other really important factors in family life. So when we talk to families and when we talk to couples, a certain number of things come up as consistent problems for almost all families that we talk to across the globe, across societies, and regardless of what developmental stage the family is in. One of those things, and usually what comes to the top of the list, is poor communications, that we don't feel like we communicate well in this family, or the couple says, we just can't talk to each other, we can't understand what we want. Another thing like that is that there's a low perceived sense of cohesion. Like, I don't feel loved in this relationship, or I don't feel like my parent, really cares about me. We talked about flexibility before, and that if things get too rigid, there's poor adjustment to the changes that are inevitable in family life, okay? Or the events that happen to families. We maybe lose our house, or somebody loses a job, or there's a serious illness. If there's too much rigidity, there's no way to respond to those kinds of natural changes that happen to families. By the same token, if there's not enough structure, if there's not enough of a clear delineation between who's an adult and who's a child, then it's chaotic. And kids actually don't do well. Some families feel, well, we want kids to feel like, they have as much say in things as we do. Well, actually, no, because kids actually feel anxious in that situation, that there needs to be some sort of structure that provides just enough structure so that family can get the work of family relationships done. And then another thing that we end up coming up against is this business of divergence of values. Now, again, because there's separate people and different people in relationships, whether it's a couple or whether it's a family, you're going to have some divergence of values, right? But when those divergences are so far or never discussed or never resolved, that's when you end up with problems that couples and families bring to us. And we're going to talk about some ways that we can address most of, if not all of these things that are up on the board. So let's start with communication and the fact that we can teach, model, and practice good communication skills that promote healthy relationships. How do you do that? Well, some of these are apparent to many of you who work with families and kids. Things like helping people to develop I statements. Instead of starting conversations or always relating to, well, you always do this, or you are always, or everybody does this, is to have people own what their perceptions, their values, and their needs are. Because that makes the conversation more authentic, and it makes it easier for people to resolve differences, okay? It's important to try to help people to listen more. Judge Judy has this saying that God gives you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I think that that's a great saying, and it really applies to families, that we tend to feel like, well, I'm a good listener, but then we're not good active listeners. We don't show people that we're actually paying attention to them by our body language, by looking at them, by putting down the cell phone or the paper or whatever we're doing and paying attention to them. In my family, we used to have this joke, my sisters and I, that we would come home from school and my mom would sometimes be watching the soap operas, and we would say, Mom, guess what happened in school? And Mom would say, well, go ahead, tell me. And I can listen, or I can hear, and I can watch the soap operas at the same time. We just all used to hoop about, how can you do two things at the same time? And, often parents do things because they think, that, they need some time to do what they want to do. But it's important to be conscious and be intentional about what am I modeling for my child, about how people should pay attention to each other. And one of the ways that you can sort of make sure that you're paying attention is this next one, is by repeating back to people what you heard them say. And not what you want them to say, not what you think they should say or what they meant by whatever they said, but what they actually said. Now, when I teach this to couples, sometimes they say, well, that feels really weird. In fact, my partner said, are you mocking me or are you turning me into a parrot? No, actually, what you're trying to do is let people know that you actually heard what they said, all right? Because that's a prelude then to them hearing whatever you say next. The problem that we make is that we tend to hear what someone said, and before we even let them know that we heard or understood them, we start going on to say what we want to say, okay? And then that doesn't end up working well, because both parties end up walking away from that thinking, they really don't get me, they really don't understand me. And what we're talking about here in general is being assertive. Now, do people understand what I mean by that term, assertive? Because sometimes when we talk about assertiveness, people think we're talking about being aggressive or being selfish, But actually, assertiveness is really sort of saying what you want and being clear about what you want. Because if you think about it, unless you say what you want clearly and directly, how's your partner supposed to know? How's your child supposed to know what your expectations are? We can't read each other's minds, right? So we have to learn how to be assertive and teach each other how assertiveness actually works for us. And if we do that effectively, we end up with what we call the positive communication cycle, where if I say what I want more often, and if the people I'm dealing with actually care about me and love me and want our family or our relationship to work, they're going to give me what I ask for more often than not, and I'm going to try to do the same for them, right? So we're going to end up with a positive cycle where we're both becoming more and more assertive, and we're both becoming more confident that we'll get what we want in the relationship, okay? That's the positive communication cycle. On the flip side, if I'm avoidant, I feel like I'm not going to tell you what I really want because you're supposed to know anyway, all right? If you love me, you'd know. Or because I don't think you're going to give it to me anyway, all right? Then that's going to end up with me feeling like, they didn't give me what I wanted, and so they must not love me. And in fact, they must, want to be taking advantage of me being in this relationship with them. All right, so I end up feeling like my partner actually, or my kids actually, they want to rip me off. They want to sort of emotionally rip me off or dominate me. So we end up with this negative cycle of avoidance. More avoidance leads to more feelings of your partner or your family members are dominating you or taking advantage of you, and then that leads to more and more avoidance. Well, I'm not going to tell somebody what I really care about if they're not going to give it to me anyway, all right? So we want to avoid the negative cycle, and we want to really indulge in that and encourage that positive cycle. It's important to look for good as well as bad. One of the consultants to this organization, Dr. Dick Miner, used to have this saying, if all we look for is problems in kids, all we'll have is problems to look for. And it sounds kind of tautological, but it's really true that we have to find a way to not just focus on problems, either in our partners or other family members, or especially in our kids. All right? We have to try to balance criticism with praise. And again, it's one of those curvilinear relationships where too much criticism shuts down interaction, and too much praise seems phony, and it doesn't seem real. We want a combination of both of those things, constructive criticism, but also at least as much praise as well. And people, researchers, a couple of researchers like John Gottman and others say that you should actually count how many good things you say to your partner or to your kids, so that you're making sure that in that bank, that emotional bank, that you've got more good stuff than bad stuff. If all you got in there is debts and bad stuff, your relationships are going to be bad. And that's what they're going to carry out into the world and do the same thing with the people that they meet in society. We want to avoid sort of mixed messages. Another one of the things that my siblings and I used to laugh about is when we knew that one of our parents was mad at us, and we'd say, Are you mad at us? Are you disappointed in us? No, I'm not mad at you. And so that's a kind of a mixed message. I don't know if that's happened to anybody else, or whether you've done that yourself. But you don't want to admit that yeah, you're right. I am kind of disappointed. And so we want to make sure that we send clear messages. And there's a way to say, yeah, I am a little disappointed, or I am a little bit angry. But that's more authentic than to give a mixed message, or the silent treatment. You're angry or you're disappointed with somebody, and instead of talking it out, you just sort of well, how was your day? It was okay. Well, maybe we should talk about that more, or at least say, I can't talk to you right now, but I'd be willing to talk about this when I'm, feeling a little bit better or in a better mood. Again, that's being assertive, being clear about what we want or where I am emotionally. And keeping in mind that there's, again, verbal and nonverbal communication, and they both matter. Let's move on to conflict resolution here, and then I want to leave some time for some questions and discussions on your part. Conflict is a normative part of all human relationships. All right? That may sound kind of obvious and self-evident, but we don't operate that way in the world as if this was true. In fact, there's all kinds of myths about conflict and one of the results of conflict, which is sometimes anger, right? So one of the myths is that if this is a healthy relationship, then we shouldn't have anger. We shouldn't be, ever in conflict. That we should never be angry in this house. We're not angry people. We love each other, so there's no such thing as anger. Or I just don't do anger. I can't handle it, or you can't handle it, or we as a family don't do conflict well. So therefore, let's just ignore it. Another myth is that some of us are walking around with is that anger is always and mostly caused by others. All right? You can make me angry. All right? It's not my fault. It's your fault. All right, you made me angry. You made me crazy. If I get angry, I'll just blow my top, and then I'll get over it, and so should everybody else. And it doesn't take into account that when I blew my top and that stuff spewed all over the place, that it actually hurt other people. So some people think that sometimes anger is a good emotion all the time, and it's something that we should, sort of celebrate in our families by our behavior. And then on the flip side of that, there's folks that think that anger is a very bad emotion, and that in fact, they feel shameful when they or others in the family express anger. So how can we do anger better? One, we can state the problem clearly and directly, okay, including, and most importantly, your part in it, okay? So if there's a problem with a conflict or a disagreement that seems to be, causing a decrease in cohesion in the family, it's really important to share not only what your understanding of the problem is and be clear about that, but what's your part in it, okay? So what's my role in the fact that, Johnny's not getting good grades? What's my role in the fact that we don't seem to be as happy as we used to in our marriage or in our relationship? Okay. Now, what do you think that does when you start the definition or start the conversation about the problem, whatever it is, by starting with your role? What do you think that does to the conversation?
Gives the other party space to take responsibility.
We're modeling for them that, I'm willing to say what I'm doing that's contributing to this, and the other person is probably going to, feel that way too. I mean, it's very rare that you'll say, well, my part in it is this, and the other person, yeah, you're right. If you wouldn't do that so much, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So stating the problem clearly and directly, but also including your part in it is a critical first step. Focusing on the problem, all right? The problem is the problem. The problem is not the other person. How often do we get into conflicts, familial or relationship conflicts, and somehow it turns into that the person we're talking to is the problem, or we're being made the problem. And all that does is get us to be defensive, right? I mean, the whole thing shuts down. So focus on the problem. Try to keep it on what it is we're supposed to be discussing. Stay in the present. Avoid dredging up past problems and conflicts. Because that is an endless cycle. So I bring up something that sort of made me angry or made me disappointed in the relationship, and then what's the other person going to do? Well, when you did this, and then we're off to the races. So we have to stay in the present. We also have to be willing to change and express that we're willing to make a difference. Okay, and this in geopolitical terms, this is the same way. I mean, we're talking about the same thing. The times that we've had sort of progress on big geopolitical problems, I'm thinking about the Middle East here, have been when both parties have been willing to change. Both parties have been willing to say, we will come to the table and talk about what we would be willing to give up or put on the table, as opposed to the times when they just stand in their corners and say, you're bad, and this is, the way that it should be, and you're not agreeing with us. It happens within families as well as on the global stage. Say what you really mean, okay? Try not to slip into, accusations or insults or sarcasm. Now, sometimes we get sort of angry about things or we've been hurt, and it's easy if we're not careful to just sort of be sarcastic with our partners or with our kids, or our kids to be sarcastic with us. But we have to avoid that stuff because it's not helpful. They're like those sticks that they throw out, that the state troopers throw out when they're trying to stop a car. Like when you throw out an insult or an accusation, it just blows out the tire of whoever's driving behind it. You don't want to do that. It's important not to become or to be defensive when we're working, with each other, and to teach families and for families to be able to teach kids not to become defensive, because all that does is cause the other parties in the discussion or the argument to become defensive. It's important to keep a sense of humor, and if we can do that, then what we can remember and what we can hold on to, that is, if one of us in this conflict loses, we both lose. Okay? If one of us wins, if one of us feels successful, we should want everybody to win. And if nothing else, this last point is probably the key, I think, to conflict resolution, successful conflict resolution. Both sides have to win. So this just sort of recaps in one slide some of the things that we've been talking about clarification, about focus, and about other kinds of ways of avoiding destroying a good conflict resolution scheme. Okay. I'm just going to run through these really quickly, and then I want to stop and have some discussion. When I'm talking to couples who are thinking about getting into relationships or young people, I usually throw out a couple of these as additional things or tips for building healthy relationships. Try not to rush into relationships. I work with a lot of young guys who are thinking about getting into relationships for the first time, or they're having problems with relationships. And what I try to urge them to do is to try to not get into this phase where they're totally infatuated and want to stop everything and move their furniture into somebody who they just had a date with. That it's important to enjoy the getting to know you phase of getting to know people, and this happens within families too. I mean, getting to know your baby, and enjoying that and sharing that with other people, both your partner, your natal partner, but also maybe with other people in the family. That phase of getting to know and start new relationships is important, and if you do it right, the relationship will be better in the long run. Making sure that you respect the need for independence, but also avoid too much independence, which is turning into isolation. This whole village concept of it takes a village to raise a child, is that it's good for individuals, couples, and families as well as for children. Remaining open to input from others, but also appreciating and developing your own insight and your own intuition and judgment. That we want to do both of those things. And in all of this, even with new parents, you want to make sure that you're having time for the couple relationship and for yourself as an individual. A lot of the families that we work with here at Washburn are blended families. And for those families, it's really important that the couple that's trying to bring these two families together, or three, that they're really nurturing their couple relationship, because the stronger that bond is, the better they're going to be able to do the other kinds of things about cohesion, flexibility, and communication that we talked about before. And these others are kind of similar, finding time for building the relationships with each individual family member. So a lot of times I hear, a step or foster parents say, well, I don't know how to build a relationship with this person. I'll leave that to the other person or to the other parent. Well, actually, it's important for you to always, if you're in the same household and you're in the same family, find a way to make sure that there's a linkage between you and everybody who's in that household. Why? Because that will contribute to family cohesion. And also using things like family traditions or altering existing family traditions and rituals, that can help build family trust and cohesion as well. So finally, I want to leave two thoughts with you. One is this idea that love is not enough to make a successful family or a successful marriage. That it takes relationship skills as well, in addition to intimacy and love and a feeling of hopefully mutual regard. That we have to have the skills to be able to negotiate the inherent conflict that comes across with family life or couple relationships. And then the second one is relationships are a little bit like gardens. If you want to have a beautiful one, you got to work on it. If you ignore relationship skills and you just pay no attention to what's happening in the relationship process, you're going to end up with weeds and rocks, and it's not going to be pretty. But if you spend the time, something really transcendent can happen in families, and something that's really, really very beautiful. So let's stop here and see what kinds of questions you have, and They can be things about, the video that we saw, or just kind of what kind of work are you doing in your jobs or in your families right now. And we'll pass the microphone around so that people who are watching on the tape can hear and participate.
Hello, my name is Tennille. I work with children at a mentoring organization. It's really fun. What I noticed in the video was that the Japanese family and the American family, in their communication, they actually looked at their children and had direct communication with them. As in comparison to the Russian family, they kind of talked indirectly to the child, kind of like in passing as they were preoccupied with something, and that was an observation that I made.
It's really astute because it speaks to this whole business about active listening and really direct communication. But it's hard to do that when you're not even looking at the person that you're talking to. Now, somebody in the earlier session mentioned that we also have to incorporate that in the Russian family that we saw, this is about 10 or 15 years old, and what was going on in Russia at that time, some of the communal violence and corruption, but also some of the worldwide wars that they were involved in, may have shaped how people were reacting with each other, but also their history. The way that communism and Stalinism was working before may have had an impact on how much people opened up their hearts to people, even people in their own family. Because it is kind of striking that as this kid is hitting his father says, "Thank you," kind of sarcastically. I mean, like, how's that supposed to work, right? So that's a great observation, though.
Actually, you segued into a question I have. Earlier on in your presentation, you had a couple of slides where it showed the external influences on a family, right? And right now we're in the technology world, and children, as well as adults and family members, have access to what's going on in the world, including, experiencing actually physical violence in schools and things our leaders are saying, and the concept of deportation and instability. So I'm curious as to, in your years of studying, how that has actually, this point in time, has impacted the family, and just some insight on, as you're nurturing your family unit, how to deal with that.
Yeah, it's definitely impacting families. And one of the things that we talked about before is we're just now starting to research and really understand how these outside influences, particularly things like technology, which seem kind of innocuous, a cell phone, giving a child a cell phone at 8 or 9 years old, or earlier, some of them, or giving them a toy that looks like a cell phone when they're 3, so that when they're 8, they're demanding a cell phone. That changes what happens in the family. It changes the calculus between the parent and the child. It also changes, what parents do themselves with cell phones, because if they do certain things, their children are going to do the same things. If they are interrupted in a conversation by a cell phone, or if they're on the screen or on the internet all the time, how can they expect their child not to be interested in being on the internet? If they go to any site that's on the internet that they want, how can they, sort of say, well, you can't, do as I do, and, or do as I say and not as I do, that whole thing. What are some tips or some things that might help people? First of all, I think people have to be aware of it. I think I work with families all the time where they're not even aware that some of the hassles they're having with their kids are because of their use or misuse of technology. So I'll be talking to a family, and a parent will say, well, they won't put that phone away. And, no matter what I do, no matter what I say, they refuse to not be on the phone in the middle of the night. And I go, well, whose phone is it? And the parent will say, well, it's his phone, or it's her phone. No, whose phone? Who's paying for the phone? And then it's like the light bulb will go on, wait a minute. Yeah, I'm the one paying for this phone, I'm the one who gave them the phone. I had another family who was having problems with their teenage son. I mean, the kid was a pretty good kid for the most part, but he was kind of entitled and really feeling like he could argue and really sort of, he would be abusive with his dad and really kind of curse his dad out sometimes. I mean, not in public, but in the home. And so there was a lot of conflict in the home. So I asked the dad, well, tell me a little bit about, what some of this conflict is about. And he said, well, my son is, and actually the son, the mother, and the father were there. And the father says, well, it started when I was not able to buy a bigger house for the family. And the son, said some sort of expletive and then said, yeah, well, you said that you were going to buy that house and then you didn't end up buying it. And, I'm just listening to this, and mom is not really saying very much because mom has been in a position of saying, I think dad is too hard on son. So then the son says, yeah, when my car needed fixing, you didn't even fix it. You didn't even, take it to the dealership. He wasn't going to take it to the dealership. Dad was supposed to take the car to the dealership. And just to sort of put a little lightness in here, I said, well, what kind of car is it? And the kid said, oh, it's an Audi A7. No, an S7, not an A7. Now, if anybody knows what Audis are, this is a $150,000 car that the father had bought the son and is wondering why the son is so entitled and feeling like he can curse dad out when dad doesn't do what dad wants. So we got to be careful what we do, even things that seem like good things or seem like generous or loving things, because they can come and boomerang back on our structure and on our authority in the family and is sort of teaching the value of things. So, I mean, that's kind of a complex example where it's value and, cohesion and all kinds of things. But I hope that answers your question a little bit about that we can use our skills in teaching relationship skills or be thoughtful about what relationship skills we need to teach to be able to have the outcomes where people are, mutually respectful, feeling like mutually obligated to each other. So, you got a question back here?
Yes. Just last week I went over to New Brighton, and they had like the largest indoor playground thing. Oh. And they have 1,000 birthday parties a year. And, I just wondered what happens in a community when it decides to spend disproportionately on children versus another community where it doesn't seem to happen.
Yeah. Well, definitely some things happen. And I think this business is about entitlement on the part of kids or guilt on the part of parents because I can't pay for that party at Chuck E. Cheese's or wherever that place is, and I start to feel guilty, or I didn't give my kid as many gifts as they said somebody else's parents gave them. Those are sort of unintended consequences of some of the decisions we make. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do for your children or for your partner what you can do. That's not the issue. I just think that we need to be aware of it, and we need to see how it might impact us. When I've gone to places around the world, and I've seen families like in Mexico or in Jamaica, which is where I'm from, and my parents are from, and China, what I see is that it doesn't take a whole bunch for families to one, feel close or to have fun around a birthday party. It doesn't take, $250 per person, at wherever they're. I mean, you can do that, but if you do that, it might have some consequences as far as how kids feel they are entitled to that, and that they, or maybe don't even have to do anything for that to happen. And then when it doesn't happen, it's war. It's a problem. So I don't know if that's what you're referring to, that how it can be differential, that these differential effects can have real effects on the family process and real effects on how people feel towards each other. And if you really loved me, you'd give me a $150,000 car before I even graduate from high school, And you didn't, because when you don't do that, then it's easy for me to curse you out because you didn't buy a $3 million house. See, and then it becomes this endless, transition, this endless progression of, what have you done for me lately?
Yeah, my point was actually a little different
Okay.
in the other direction, in the sense that some communities you don't see anything for children to do, right? And then you see another community where they have a lot for children to do. It even varies between churches. You go to a church where there's a lot of focus on kids and their development, and then another one was like an adult congregation and not anything for kids. So, I don't know. I just feel that that societies can vary so much.
Yeah.
And you wonder what it is about the history or culture of that cluster or that community that leads to that differentiated focus on children.
Well, sometimes it's socioeconomic need, Sometimes it's the immigration experience that means that people have to do more at younger ages. They have to be responsible at earlier times. Youngsters have to get out into the world of work, maybe in their teenage years instead of in their 20s. So I think that's some of it, what you're talking about. I'm a big believer that even toddlers and school-age kids can have responsibilities within their homes. And when they don't have any chores, they don't have anything they need to do, then you're setting yourself up for when they're 14 or 15 and you ask them to clean their room and they look at you like, what, why? You never asked me to do anything before, which is the truth, right? I mean, like when my nephew was little, I mean, just, things like when I was making meals with him or if I was doing anything, it was like get him to do his little part, whether it's to put the napkins on the table or whatever, to help me to make the meal or whatever, because then kids start to learn that there are mutual obligations in families. It's not all about what the big people do, all right? It's what I contribute as well. And those kinds of kids are in a better position when they get to be teenagers, and particularly when they get to be young adults, to have mutually respectful relationships, not only with significant others, but with the world of work, because they understand that you do need to show up on time, you do need to do your job, and that you're not owed a salary just because you happen to have that job and you showed up at 9 o'clock. So I mean, it has all kinds of cascading effects when we give kids responsibility as early as they can handle it. Now the flip side of that is also can be problematic. We don't want to give kids too much responsibility or put on kids what they shouldn't have to do at too young ages. But I think in most Western societies and most sort of economically fortunate societies, we run the risk of not giving kids enough responsibility at young enough ages so that they learn what that means and how that works. Oh.
It's late. I've been going a long time today, so I hope my question is formalized adequately. I think maybe I'll start off with an observation, just noticing the Asian Japanese family or community, and this idea that learning is happening and being communicated in nonverbal ways, and just the significance of that. And it makes me think about, I'm originally from Milwaukee and grew up with, in an African-American, mostly predominant African-American community, and how there was a community where kids were parented and raised collectively. Mm-hmm. And when I came here and I had my own children, that wasn't the case. The community was more diverse, racially, ethnically, and there wasn't the same kind of support that we saw in that image with that community here, and just thinking about how that impacted my kids and other kids who have that experience now in diverse communities, and how is it then that how kids are taught, and how those values, those family values, get instilled. When the community or the neighborhood is so diverse that everybody living there potentially don't have the same values, that they were raised in different places. They may have the same socioeconomic level or status, but religiously, ethnically, there's lots of differences. I remember when my kids, growing up, again, living in the community that I did, most of the people looked like me. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of talking about race and ethnicity didn't really occur the way that it needed to occur here. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so those are just some thoughts, and hopefully it was clear enough.
Yeah, I think that this idea that not only family values can be communicated to children, but communities can contribute and communicate values. And they can teach skills too, like who can you turn to when you need something? Who are you safe with? And I think you're posing a really interesting kind of dilemma that with as much economic and financial security that we've sort of developed over the years. If you look at families now versus maybe families 100 years ago, more families are more economically secure in some ways. They have more stuff, more material stuff. But as far as safety and security and knowing each other and knowing what family and communal values are, I'm not sure that that's happening, as you're sort of alluding. That it seems like more of that went on at times when maybe we didn't have as much stuff and we didn't have as much financial security. And maybe it's that lack of financial security and stuff that caused us to have to communicate more with each other within families, but also between families in communities. I think it's a fascinating idea. Yeah. Yes, we have some.
Nonverbal communication, actually that was part of my question, and looking at the differences of the families, so much of it was in nonverbal communication. The Japanese family and said very, very little. And even with the African American family, although there were lots of words spoken, much of the nonverbal communication was very similar, so that balance was there as the narrator was talking about. My question is more around just that whole idea of nonverbal communication and how you connect that with how families can better communicate as a unit, and how people who are mediators, who have connections with children without having the connection of family as much, teachers, mentors. The therapists here at Washburn mostly have connection with families, right? I mean, the work you do with children usually is through that lens of family, and so you have that benefit, whereas others out in the community that work much with children don't. So just that connection of nonverbal communication, how much was communicated, the words were there, and then the impact that has on the wider community who has those connections with many children who don't have those things that families are supposed to provide: stability, security, communication. So I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense to me, because what it says is that what kids see is as important as what they hear. What they see modeled, what they see actually transacted in behavior between adults or between adults and kids is almost as important as what they hear in their own family. So both things are important. And I mean, I think about people in my life, and I thought, I've heard, you, Larry Tucker, speak about this. There were people in the community that I grew up with who were not blood relatives, but they were important in my life. I mean, and they shaped both my concept of what it was to be a man, to be male, to be, a person of color, what it meant to be, a person, an immigrant, a recent immigrant, or my parents were. It shaped all kinds of things just by watching them. It wasn't anything that they said to me or wrote down and said, this is what you need to know. And it wasn't the totality of everything that I learned. It was part of it. And kids are very good at this. They're good at watching and listening and then trying to synthesize that stuff. Even that little kid, that little Russian kid, I mean, he's synthesizing what he's seeing and what his body is feeling and experiencing, and he's taking that out into the world. And if the community, as the narrator said, can in some ways counteract some of the things that shouldn't be happening inside the family, but they can counteract that outside the family, then there's hope for a kid like that, that things can turn out to be good. So I think it's a fascinating idea about the nonverbal being as important, and the modeling. And that's why we put modeling up there, because that's just as important. And for many of us who are not related to a child, I'm always aware, wherever I go and whatever I do, that there are kids who are watching me. And there are kids that are watching me on all kinds of dynamics. They're watching me as a male. There are white kids watching me as an African American. There are, all kinds of situations like that where they're watching to see, if I get on a mountain bike and go on a trail, people are saying, oh, we didn't know black people, did mountain biking. I mean, hey, when I walk into Orchestra Hall, people, we didn't know that they listened to, some of it's crazy, but some of it is, and all the time we're modeling. And if we're conscious about it and intentional about it, we can get better outcomes in our communities. So, Any other questions or thoughts or reactions? I think we have time for a couple more, or one more. A couple more, anyway.
So I've noticed in my oldest son and in at least two other young people that they're doing a lot of asking for permission of their very young children. Let's go back in the house, okay? And I'm just wondering if you've seen a trend of this or where this has come from, or...
It's not a trend. I mean, it's always been out there. Let me take that back. I think it has gotten more post-baby boom. I think before then, parents really weren't that concerned about whether you wanted to come inside or not. If you wanted to stay outside, that's fine with me. As at least my parents. I mean, that was not an issue. But I think almost as a reaction to that, the post-baby boom generations have become more concerned about how can we be more democratic, or how can we, sort of make sure that we are nurturing our children's sense of autonomy and our children's sense of what they want, and hopefully helping them to be assertive. But I think we can go too far in that direction, because then we can go in a direction where parents feel obligated to try to negotiate things with their kids that shouldn't be negotiated. So I've worked with a couple, actually I've worked mostly with the father, who's had problems in the relationship with his natal partner, with the mother, the child's mother. And the child has gotten into some tantrum behavior with the mother, who he lives with most of the time. And this child is now, when I first met this couple, the child was about 6 or 7. The child is like 10 now. So he's getting to be physically bigger. And he's also, at an age where having a 2-year-old meltdown is not really appropriate. So in talking to the father and asking him, so what happens that causes these tantrums, he'll sort of narrate and sort of spell it out. Well, I ask him to clean his room, and he doesn't. So then I come back and I say, will you please clean your room? And he doesn't. He gets angry, and he might curse at me, or he might, just ignore me. And then I'll say, the reason you have to clean your room is because if we don't do, cleanliness, and I say, wait a minute, why are you pleading with your son? Why are you negotiating this with your son, your 10-year-old son? And he says, well, no, I'm not negotiating, I'm not pleading. And I said, well, let's talk about it again. Because, when we get into this, we slip into this stuff, and we don't even hear ourselves doing it when we're doing parenting. But even when we're talking about couples, and they're being critical of each other, they're being sarcastic, they don't even catch it because they're in the middle of it. Did you hear that you were just being sarcastic with your partner? No. Well, let me repeat back what you said. So often it's really important to help people who you catch doing that kind of thing, is to sort of repeat it back and say, did I hear this right? Did you say that you asked him whether he wanted to come inside when it was getting dark and it was starting to rain and it was time to come inside? Did you hear yourself pleading with your son to put down the cell phone at the dinner table? I mean, is that really what you want to do? And if so, what kinds of results are you going to get? So I think helping people to see what they are not really seeing is a big part of addressing the problem that you're talking about. I think we're kind of at that time, huh? You've been a wonderful audience. I hope we've learned some things together, and, keep on working on family relationships.
I want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Allen, and a huge thank you to all of you for showing up tonight. I was really struck again in listening to the talk, that idea of how important and powerful it is to really be seen and heard. And the theme of that tonight, a whole big group of us were just at a session that Larry Tucker from Kente Circle and Resma Menachem did, and there was a big focus in that, and also really slowing down and listening, seeing, and helping the other person to really feel heard. I got to see Brene Brown last week, and her main thing that she talked about was the importance of connection and really slowing down and listening, so that other person knows you are there with them, you're present, and they see and hear you and value you. And that's what really came through to me for tonight. So I'm really grateful that all of you showed up tonight. This kind of session is only possible through the really generous support of the whole Washburn community of our donors. And in particular, I want to say a huge thank you to Brent and Marilyn Marmo, who are right here with us tonight, and to Leslie and Stuart Crosby as well, who really initiated both this whole idea and have provided the support to help make it happen. So can we say a thank you to them? And this really is set up to be a community dialogue series. So we love the conversation with it. And I want to invite you all to come back in July. We also have a partnership with the Stanton Adams Diversity Institute. And in July will be the next session in our Equity and Access Community Dialogues. In September, we'll also be wrapping things up for the 2018 series with Dr. Ann Garrity. So hope you will come back. All of that information is on our website. Take a look, and we hope to see you all again. Thanks for coming out. Good night.